Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're doing our second video in what I think is going to be a three-part series talking about reactivating the Iowas in the 1980s and some research I've been doing there recently. I, of course, got into Iowa-class battleships because of my interest in World War II. The 80s is so recent, I was born in 1990, that I never really thought about it as history and was never too interested with it. Certainly being on the ship in her 80s configuration has caused me to learn a lot more about that time period than I ever did before I got the job. But recently, in doing research on the fight to bring the Iowa class back in the 1980s, I've really gotten into the time period. So just to recap, there are going to be three videos. We've already done one on the one person who was most responsible for doing it, Charles Myers. And since that video, we have found a couple of his grandkids and started talking with them about where his archival collection might have ended up. So we're hoping to learn even more information about him in the future. There's a link to that video in the description down below if you haven't seen it yet. This video is going to be a timeline of reactivating the battleship. And in the near future, we're going to do a video where we talk about some of the prominent personalities on either side of the reactivation debate. There were some very big names who were entirely opposed to it, and there were some very big names that were entirely for it, and we'll talk about some of what they said and some of their reasons behind it. Because, honestly, it was not unreasonable for people to say, why are we going to bring back a class of ships that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world that's 40 years old? And I'm certainly not going to make that video with the idea of doxing people for being opposed to it, because they had some really legitimate arguments. But it'll be fun if Charles Myers is the guy who was perhaps most responsible for bringing the Iowas back. You'll be real interested to hear who the person most responsible for keeping them out of service was. That's not something that's going to be covered in this video. And so today's video is going to be something of a timeline, looking at some of the research I've recently done on reactivating the Iowas. And some of these factors are going to be things that are no-brainers. Some of them might be stuff you've never heard of before, hopefully. And you'll probably notice that I'm weaving 3 or 4 different narratives together here. There's some stuff that's happening in the wider world. There's some political stuff going on. There's some stuff happening in Charles Myers' life. And all these things are winding back and forth over about a decade that we're looking at, that the argument for bringing the ships back. So that's why this video is sort of organized the way it is. So first up, 17 December 1969, Battleship New Jersey is decommissioned at the end of the Vietnam War. At this point, there are no more active battleships anywhere in the world. However, the 4 Iowa-class battleships are still held in mothballs by the United States Navy for possible, though unlikely, reactivation. Throughout the 1970s, particularly the early 70s, the U.S. Navy is following the policies set out by the Chief of Naval Operations, Elmo Zumwalt. He was following a high-low concept where we needed both really expensive, high-end type ships, the supercarriers, for example, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and really cheap, low-end ships. Ships like the frigates. Ships that could be thrown at convoy escort missions in large numbers. He believed that there should be ships of both the high and low spectrum in each category. So for the aircraft carriers, you would need those big supercarriers, and then also some smaller ships. I'm not sure I entirely agree with his theory, but it does hold true, especially in World War II, where you've got things like the fleet carriers, and then the light carriers that were modifications to supplement the fleet carriers, and the escort carriers, which often were used as convoy escorts and for aircraft transports and things like that. Likewise, you had full-on fleet destroyers that were able to do everything. You had destroyer escorts. You have heavy and light cruisers. You have old and new battleships, and there tended to be distinctions between the jobs of all these vessels. So Zumwalt and the other naval officers who are at a high rank grew up in this World War II time frame, and so it makes sense that they would look at the Navy this way. This is important because it's going to come up in one of the threads of this timeline. In spring of 1972, there's a North Vietnamese offensive on the south. Congress looks at reactivating the Iowa-class battleships, and Admiral J. Edward Snyder, the commanding officer of New Jersey during the Vietnam War, is summoned to the White House to be asked if New Jersey can be reactivated in 30 days and sent over there as a deterrent to the North Vietnamese offensive. He says that the ship has a lot of life left in her, but that she cannot be reactivated that quickly. Instead, the last gunship that the Navy has, the heavy cruiser Newport News, is rushed over in her place. In 1973, the Navy conducts a feasibility study to see if the Iowa-class battleships can be equipped with Aegis and turned into air defense systems. Also in 1973, Admiral Zumwalt wrote, "Conversion of the Iowa-class battleships had been considered and studied, but all had reached the same conclusion. The ships were too old, too manpower intensive, too expensive to operate, and too costly, especially in comparison to the new sea control ship design." We'll come back to the sea control ship later on. 1974, in March of 1974, the Soviets lay down the battlecruiser Kirov. She is the first of what at that time was planned to be a 5-ship class, ended up being a 4-ship class. And they are the largest surface combatants built since World War II. Many of the American reactions will be in response to the construction of the Kirov-class battlecruisers and the general trend of the Soviet Union in transitioning from an all-submarine navy to being a potent and capable surface navy in their own right, operating carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and now battle cruisers. In spring 1974, the Surface Combatant Directorate of Naval Ship Systems Command, firmly believing that the mothballed battleships would never go to sea again, and concerned that an inordinate amount of time and money was being spent to support the 4 ships, recommended that they be stricken from the Navy list. This is 1 year after Zumwalt says that reactivating them is not possible. They already started a pre-strike inspection, and the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James Holloway, rescinds the order, keeping them in mothballs. In 1975, the Navy conducts a study to explore a variety of missile installations, including the Sea Sparrow, Aegis, and Harpoons, on the Iowa-class battleships. This is the 3rd time since New Jersey was decommissioned in 1969, so the 3rd time in 6 years that the Navy has looked at reactivating these ships. In 1976, the Ford administration cancels the strike cruiser program. These were supposed to be large cruisers armed with Aegis, armed with missiles, and armed with 8-inch guns for shore bombardment. They would have also been of an appropriate size for countering the Kirov class. To fill this gap, the Ticonderoga class cruisers then being designed were actually Spruance class destroyers with a new superstructure bolted on. They get upgraded from destroyers to being called cruisers, even though they're on a destroyer hull. So at this point, the Navy has lost all of its gunships. They've had the program canceled that was going to replace them. This isn't the last time that a program to replace the battleship shore bombardment capability is canceled. And so the Navy has to change the name of one of the ship classes they're building as their attempted way of keeping a number of cruiser parities with the Soviet Union. 1978 brings our friend Chuck Myers into the equation. That's the year when he stops working at the Pentagon and becomes a consultant specializing in tactical weapons conceptual development. At some point later that year, he conducts a study on the current defense market for one of his clients. I think it's Martin Marietta, but I don't know that for certain. This study determines that the military is missing a way to provide continuous all-weather fire support following a forcible entry into a foreign country. So, naval shore bombardment. Following this, sometime in spring of 1978, he has lunch with a former naval officer named Charles Haskell. He asks Haskell to tell him everything he knows about battleships. Haskell gets Myers into the Naval Academy library to start studying, and he uses several of the books that we probably have on our shelves, Garsky and Doolin's U.S. Battleships, among others. And then Myers flies to Wilmington to tour the Museum Battleship North Carolina and see what condition she's in. Later that same year, Haskell introduces Myers to both Admiral Snyder and Captain Peniston, the two commanding officers of New Jersey during the Vietnam War. Both tell him that the Iowas are in good condition and have many years of steaming life ahead of them. Remember, earlier Snyder had said that they couldn't reactivate New Jersey in 30 days, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't reactivate the ship at all. Also in 1978, the Sea Control Ship, which I mentioned a few paragraphs earlier, which is a mini vertical takeoff and landing aircraft carrier, is canceled. This is supposed to be the low end of Admiral Zumwalt's high-low spectrum for aircraft carriers. So now the Navy has lost their high end of cruisers and their low end of aircraft carriers, so there is nothing in that close support category that those two types of ships would have covered. The following year, on November 4th, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran is seized and 53 Americans are taken hostage. This begins to show that the United States is not going to get involved in a peer-on-peer conflict, but will instead be playing whack-a-mole around the globe with a number of quote-unquote third world actors or failed states or smaller countries. Like, we're not going to go to war with the Soviet Union. We have to be ready to deploy battle groups and shore forces around the world. And you see that happening a lot in the 70s and 80s. So that theory ends up being correct. In November 1979, the exact same month as the Iran hostage situation starts, Charles Myers' first advocacy article in Naval Institute Proceedings magazine is published. In this, he argues that the Iowa-class battleships should be modified with a flight deck in place of turret 3, which would then be able to replace the Sea Control Ship and the strike cruiser programs, both of which had been canceled. Remember, he's working as an advocate for defense contractors. These defense contractors are not getting money for new construction, so Myers comes up with the idea of getting money by reactivating an older ship, and maybe that will be easier to pass through Congress. Just 1 year later, December 24th, 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Further proof that the late 20th century isn't going to see a war between superpowers. It's going to be superpowers and quote-unquote third world nations fighting each other. In February 1980, Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Robert Barrow, contradicts the Secretary of Defense in front of a congressional hearing, saying that air power is not adequate as a supplement for naval gunfire support during amphibious operations. Also in early 1980, Martin Marietta releases a model showing an Iowa-class battleship with a flight deck on its stern. This is why I believe that they're the company that Myers is advocating for during this time period. April of 1980, Operation Eagle Claw is launched to try and free the hostages in Iran. It's an abysmal failure, and the Carter administration looks weak on military spending and has a series of other issues related to their relations with the military at a time when the Soviet Union is increasing in power. In response, in spring 1980, a $6.2 billion supplementary military defense budget is put before Congress by the Senate Armed Forces Committee. This includes $350 million to fundraise the first production run of Tomahawk cruise missiles, but the bill is cut, authorizing just 68 missiles and no ships able to carry the missiles. In June 1980, Ronald Reagan is chosen as the Republican nominee to challenge Carter in the upcoming election. He runs on a platform of higher military spending, including a 600-ship Navy. In July 1980, Marine engineer Harold Pulver submits a reply in Proceedings magazine to Myers, which further refines the design of the battle carrier concept. Congress solicits designs to extend the life of the Iowa-class battleship, and Harold Pulver's submission of a battle carrier conversion is the most seriously considered of the designs. In September of 1980, Myers circulates a roughly 50-page document he wrote called Reactivation of Iowa-class Battleships, a Basis for Advocacy, around Congress, particularly the Armed Forces Committees. He follows up by visiting congressional offices advocating for the reactivation of Iowa-class battleships. Russell Hale, who is a former naval aviator and senior staff member on the Sea Power Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, forwards copies of this document on to powerful congressmen and Graham Claytor, the Secretary of the Navy, who then passed it on to the Chief of Naval Operations. In October of 1980, the Navy contacts John J. McMullen and Associates to come up with a report on turning New Jersey into a battle carrier. That's one of the documents that we found in the box of collections of battle carrier blueprints. In November 1980, Reagan wins the election, partially on his promise of increasing the size of the Navy from 450 ships to 600. Now, he needs ships that can be quickly reactivated or built within his 4-year term to prove that he's doing what he said he would do. He also needs ships that are able to carry the Tomahawk cruise missile. In December 1980, a month after winning the election, John Lehman and Richard Allen jointly proposed battleship reactivation to the president-elect. Reagan is enthusiastic about the idea. At the end of the month, 30 December 1980, the battlecruiser Kirov is commissioned. The U.S. Navy still has no counter to that ship. And it would take at least a decade to design and build a new capital ship capable of matching her in size and firepower. In February 1981, the Navy completes the study of the battle carrier conversion. The proposed price tag is between $2 billion and $2.15 billion to remove Turret 3, add a flight deck, and add vertical launch cells for Tomahawk cruise missiles. In March 1981, Senator John Tower introduces the fiscal 1982 Defense Appropriations Bill, including $325 million in funding for reactivating New Jersey and starting the process on Iowa. In April 1981, New Jersey is taken in hand for reactivation work. Sometimes thereafter, Myers and Haskell have lunch with Captain Fogarty, who has just been nominated to be the first commanding officer of New Jersey. They fill him in on the backstory of the efforts to bring the battleship back into service. In July 1981, Gene Anderson offers a further improvement on the Pulver design for a battle carrier conversion in Proceedings magazine. In November 1981, Senator Denton makes a speech about battleship gunfire support, which helps get funding for Iowa, which at that point was being debated. In December 1981, the fiscal 1982 defense budget was signed by President Reagan. In May 1982, with New Jersey already undergoing reactivation work, Howard Serig publishes the Iowa class Needed Once Again in Proceedings magazine. In September of 1982, a study requested by Congress is completed which considered the possibility of reactivating Des Moines and Salem as less expensive alternatives to reactivating Wisconsin and Missouri. It was decided that while less expensive, there would be too much of a loss in capabilities by doing that. December of 1982, New Jersey is reactivated under Captain William Fogarty. March 1983, New Jersey gets the first 8 out of those 68 Tomahawks that was authorized back in 1980, and test fires the first one in May. That's a land attack version, with the first sea attack version being tested in December of 1985. While the reactivation work on the Iowa-class battleships was relatively straightforward, retaining all the 16-inch guns and adding Tomahawk missiles and some other modern systems, there was a Phase 2 plan which was going to be conducted exclusively on New Jersey, which would have happened at the end of the 1980s when New Jersey goes in for her first major maintenance cycle. This Phase 2 plan originally would have included removing Turret 3 and putting a flight deck on, like Myers and others had advocated for initially. On October 18, 1983, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman writes Congress saying that for budgetary reasons, they were not looking at a Phase 2 conversion of the Iowas in the next 5 years. This seems to be the point when that idea dies. January 11, 1984, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser Bunker Hill is laid down. She is the first ship equipped with vertical launch cells. It will not be until September 20th, 1986 that she is commissioned into the fleet, which shows why it was so important to get the Iowas out there as quickly as possible to get Tomahawk-capable ships in the fleet. Even though the Iowa-class battleships are all undergoing conversion at this time, there's still a fight to stop that process or take them out of service. And so advocates continued to publish articles trying to keep them around. In May 1984, Howard Serig again publishes an article in Proceedings, this time called Stretching the Fleet into the 1990s, where he talks about keeping the Iowa class around longer. By 1992, all of the Iowas have now been decommissioned, but the effort to keep them around continues, with Charles Myers publishing one last article in Proceedings called Not So Fast, about reactivating the Iowas yet again. That same year, 1995, Martin Marietta merges with Lockheed to form Lockheed Martin. This may end Charles Myers' relationship with Martin Marietta. I'm not entirely sure, but it's interesting to me that in 1995 he publishes his last article, the companies merge, and then he stops advocating for the Iowa-class battleships at that point. Anyway, that's my timeline so far. What sort of stuff am I missing? Are there other threads and narratives that should be wound into this? Let us know in the comment section down below. Were all of these reasons for keeping the Iowa class around, or can you think of some other ones? Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate the support. There's a link in the description below for ways to donate to support the museum. It's what gives us the free time to not only restore the ship, but to do research like this that expands our knowledge of the Iowa-class battleships. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about the museum and the channel. Thanks for watching.